Hi, it's Frank. We're back with another video lesson in our Navigating the Federal Software Sales Market Learning Path. We are in Module 1, and this is Lesson 1.2. How is the sales cycle different in the federal government? We're going to cover three primary points in this lesson. Number 1, government's unique fiscal calendar. Number 2, how to develop business in the federal cycle, and this is really just going to be an introduction to this topic. And finally, 3 categories of the government prospect, and that's the individuals that you may be engaging with as you develop business. All right, the first thing to know is this is a very long game of federal sales. It's not as quick at all as it is in the commercial sector, and you're just going to have to be prepared for that. One of the reasons is government doesn't really operate on a traditional quarterly calendar like you may have seen in the private sector. They've got their own fiscal year, and it's characterized by the end of the year in September and the start of the fiscal year in October. This is because Congress gives agencies their budget in October, at least in principle. Lately, agencies have been operating under something called continuing resolutions. This is where Congress can't quite appropriate or agree on a budget to give to the government, and as a result, while the fiscal year starts in October, many agencies don't receive their budgets until much later than that, sometimes all the way into March. And government's calendar is characterized by a fourth quarter spending spree. When you don't get your budget until a few months into a fiscal year, you typically don't have a lot of the benefit of 12 months of buying. And so as a result, you have this fourth quarter use it or lose it principle where agencies focus on spending all of their budget by September 30th so they can request the same amount from Congress the next year. Now, like I said, it really is a long game. You might learn of an opportunity in October, and it could take until March to actually get the solicitation out, and then the contract itself may not be approved until that following June. That's a 9-month cycle, and that would actually be considered fairly efficient in federal government, if you can believe it or not. So when you're developing business opportunities in the federal government, you'll want to keep that calendar in mind, but we also want to make this contextual for you. So we're going to talk a little bit about traditional commercial sales and see if we can sort of tie some lessons in from how to operate in the government sales cycle from the mindset of selling in the commercial sector. So how is a typical sales cycle impacted by the way government works and thinks? Well, 3 simple phases in any commercial sales cycle, and you might have different permutations here, but traditionally prospecting, developing, and proposing progression. So in prospecting, you're going to want to be thinking about what your customers are reading or listening to or watching, and in this case, it's the government professionals. And we're going to talk a little bit about this coming up too, exactly what they're reading and listening to. Has Congress released the agency's budget? Do they have their funds? Do they know what their priorities are? This is something to be thinking about when you're prospecting business. And finally, you're going to want to identify the purchasing vehicles that offer similar software to yours. So in other words, where is government currently purchasing the software categories that you'd ultimately like to sell? We're going to talk about purchasing vehicles in another lesson. In the developing stage, you'll want to recall the buyer's risk-averse mentality. Government professionals, like we talked about in lesson 1.1, are very process-oriented. They are very risk-averse. They are not incentivized to get creative and to press the issue all the time. So there is that risk-averse mentality, and as a result, discussions are open, but they can be delicate. You're going to want to develop relationships with all members of the team. This is key. We're going to talk exactly about who these members are coming up. Just know that in the developing business stage, that's where the relationships have to be developed. It can't wait till the end or when the solicitation or offer is already out on the street, because that's when you're proposing. And proposals to the government follow a formal process. And they have to comply with specific rules, like we talked about in lesson 1.1, that federal acquisition regulation that really dictates the buying behaviors and practices of federal agencies. Now, there are flexibilities if you know where to look for them, and we're going to help you find those flexibilities as we continue through this path. Now, prospecting and developing federal business does necessitate an understanding of the federal government's procurement lifecycle. It's a 4-phase. Some people will make it 3, some people will make it 5. We like 4, and it's pretty simple. There's a planning phase, and that's where the customer is defining their requirement. They usually do that through a lot of market research, and so you're going to want to show up on that market research process itself, or that net that they cast. And you're going to have informal and open communication in the planning stage. Before the requirement has been developed, that's the time when you want to be talking to potential customers and buyers about what you offer and the benefits and the key differentiators. Once the solicitation goes out, that's when the buyer actually starts requesting offers, and then your communication, the informal aspect of communication, ceases. There's a field of competition that gets defined. You're going to want to understand what that field of competition is. Sometimes the government can set contracts aside for certain socioeconomic categories, and if you're not a part of that socioeconomic category, you may not be eligible to bid. And so that's why the solicitation method really dictates your offer strategy. You can make partnerships with companies that will be eligible to bid, and that's going to be something that's driven by how the government is choosing to buy. In the award phase, you'll often have this situation where you submit the proposal and you refresh your email or check it pretty constantly for a couple of days, and you might not hear anything for a couple of weeks. That's because the government's award procedures are formal, and there usually are layers of accountability and layers of process check that occur before the government can actually approve a purchase. And that can be a cost driver for you, especially if you have any type of services that are packaged around installing that software or delivering that software. You're going to you're effectively going to have to keep those resources available, because once you've made an offer to the government, if the government accepts it, that's a binding offer, and you don't have the luxury of saying, yes, well, we had other opportunities and we're no longer interested in that. We will talk about that more. There will not be much communication at all. You may only hear that the government has received your proposal or your offer, and you may not hear anything again. It only may be that you see an announcement made about who actually won the award, and that's how you discover that you didn't win. You will want to request debriefings when you can, and we're going to have some tips for you on that. In post-award, that's when things are actually being delivered. You're going to want to think about licenses that you want to sell for renewal purposes. Make that easy. Try to make that a part of your contract if you can. If you're offering any type of operations and maintenance services, that's going to be listed in your contract, and that would occur during the post-award phase. You really want to become indispensable here. You want your product to be so useful to the government that they cannot live without it, and so that's what you want to be thinking about during post-award, so that you can ensure that you get that next contract or that next option. Now, talking the talk, it's really important to understand how to communicate with government employees, but even government employees aren't the same, so we've kind of categorized them into three buckets. There's the requirements owner, the influencer, and the acquisition professional. We're going to go through some tips on how to communicate with these individuals. First, we're going to learn a little bit about who they are. The requirements owner, this individual has the need for the product or solution that's being provided. They will typically make the budget request or write the business case to make a new purchase. They're oftentimes the top decision maker. They may or may not have significant influence on the contracting officer. This really varies by agency and by individual, and it's why it's so important to start understanding the dynamics of the government agency that you're trying to penetrate. Influencers are typically mid-level and senior-level managers. They have authority to approve budget requests from the requirements owners, and they will set buying strategies. These individuals can be politically appointed, and that would mean they have a specific mandate and oftentimes a limited tenure to get that mandate done. The third type of government prospect is the acquisition professional. These are career civil servants. They're involved in the acquisition process, either as contracting officers or program managers. These people are responsible for the many process-oriented decisions that take place in the procurement lifecycle. They will have input from requirements owners, but determining the field of competition or the type of contract that they're going to use to buy your software, that's the type of process decision that your acquisition professional is going to make. Typically, they'll only meet with vendors in formal sessions. That's not a hard and fast rule. There are some progressive contracting officers and program managers out there that are more willing to engage in communication. So know what to say and who to say it to. For a requirements owner, you're going to want to use standard prospecting techniques. These individuals are going to be likely to meet with you. They will be receptive to your sales process. They may have come from industry and have an understanding of what you're ultimately trying to do. One of the things you'll want to do probably in your prospecting phase is to learn a little bit about the agency's mission and their budget priorities and what Congress is telling them to do, because you're going to want to use that language when you're talking with the requirements owner, so it shows that you've done your homework. And to that effect, come prepared with an answer if they do ask you how they could possibly buy you. What we mean there is, are you on any vehicles, or do you hold a GSA schedule contract that they could use to purchase your software? Do you have distributor relationships? Are you on something like NASA's SOUP vehicle, which we're going to talk about? But that's where it's important to understand your company and how they typically intend to take their product to the government market. When you're talking to influencers, you're going to want to leverage the relationship. These individuals are difficult to formally engage, and what I mean by that is it's tough to get on their calendar, but they're oftentimes active networkers, so you can find them at networking events. You can find them at association events or happy hours or anything like that. So look for them maybe outside of the office. That's a good place to develop relationships. They are not typically involved in decisions about individual contracts. They won't get down to that level, but they can still be pretty influential over what's ultimately purchased. You're going to want to appeal to their broader strategic objectives. This is especially true for appointees. So are these people all about improving transparency, or do they deal with cross-functional teams? Are they trying to increase security? What are the hot button topics for these influencers? Understand that so that when you do have an opportunity to talk with them, you can kind of turn them on a little bit and then link that to the software that you want to sell them. For acquisition professionals, I mentioned earlier that there's some contracting professionals that are a little bit more progressive than others. You want to treat these career professionals formally at first until they address you differently. I mean, that is Mrs. and Mr. we're talking about here. After you've established a relationship, obviously that will change, but it's best to start formally before you go to a more colloquial way of addressing them. Don't talk about your competitors or any competitors that you envision. That's a real trigger of possible ethics issues for contracting officers or program managers. They don't want to be in any situation where they might divulge competitive information. So just don't even bring up competitors. Focus on your solution, what your product does, and why it's valuable. Avoid the hard sell, really. Focus on understanding process challenges. What I mean by this is, what's going to dictate the solicitation process. Maybe this particular agency has missed their socioeconomic goals, and as a result, the contracting officer is telling you that basically means, look, I'm going to have to set this aside for a small business. If you're not a small business, you're going to want to find a partner who is, so that you can still be eligible to compete for that contract. Other process challenges might be, authority to operate. Maybe the agency requires that this particular software that the program needs has an ATO, an authority to operate. And that's a long process. Can you alleviate that? Can you get your ATO already? How can you help the contracting officer work through that so they can get the contract done and get everything out quickly? So we're going to have some resources in the tracks that follow that kind of outline all of this for you. You're going to want to take a close look at that, print them out, stick them on the wall, be familiar with how these people act and operate, so that when you do engage them, you can do that in an informed way. And that's really why it's important to understand all the way to the beginning of the government's buying process, its cycle, and how you can kind of navigate that world. All right, so we'll see you in the next track.